The procession bearing the funeral bier of Germanicus, led by Agrippina, made its slow way to the town of Terracina. Surrounded by marshlands, Terracina lay only 2 days from Rome, marking the near end of Agrippina's pilgrimage. Very soon, she and her 4 youngest children would reunite with her 2 eldest, Nero and Drusus. Then, together as a family, they would lay their father's ashes to rest within the mausoleum of Augustus. The journey that began the moment her husband died in Syria was long and arduous. For Agrippina, the struggle started with the funeral arrangements. Roman law forbade the burning of a funeral pyre within the city limits, but what could Antioch's bureaucrats do when Agrippina, backed by Syria's new governor, Gaius Sentius Saturninus, and a host of military commanders loyal to her dying husband, ordered the pyre to be constructed in Antioch's forum? And so the people came, not just from Antioch, but from surrounding regions as well, the Nabateans, Judeans, Syrians, Sidonians, Tyrians, Cappadocians, and Cypriots, all to mourn the loss of Germanicus. So that before his body was consumed by flame, all in attendance could bear witness to the rashes, the markings, and the discolorations that proved her husband had been murdered. Agrippina displayed Germanicus's corpse, without clothing. She also made it known that before his death, Germanicus had named his murderers, former governor of Syria Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso and his wife, Munatia Plancina. Following the emotional funeral, Agrippina placed her husband's urn on a ship and, with her children, Caligula, Agrippinilla, Drusilla, and Livilla, set sail for Italy under the protection of Vibius Marsus and Publius Vitellius. As it was winter, the fast military vessel known as the Hemiolia hugged the coastline, avoiding the deeper, more treacherous waters of the Mediterranean. Somewhere along the banks of Lycia, the city where her brother, Gaius Caesar, had lost his life, a small fleet of ships approached Agrippina's Hemiolia from the direction of the Greek islands, and flying Roman banners. As the ships passed, Agrippina was stunned and outraged to see Piso and Plancina standing on the deck of a passing trireme. Of course, Piso was heading to Syria to reclaim his governorship. But Sentius Saturninus had anticipated just such a move. Even before Agrippina left Syria, Saturninus had replaced many centurions from the Gallica, Ferrata, and Fulminata legions with men loyal to himself and to Germanicus. Wherever Piso made his first move, word would quickly reach him. Vibius Marsus, standing beside Agrippina on the deck of the Hemiolia, shouted across the water, "Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, you are going the wrong way." He then pointed toward Italy. "You must return to Rome and stand trial for the poisoning of Germanicus." From across the water between the passing vessels, Piso replied, "I will be there, just as soon as the praetor who tries poisoning cases fixes a date." After this brief exchange, the ships drifted too far apart to continue, leaving Agrippina and Marsus to ponder Piso's meaning. His words hinted at a determination to defend himself, but only once the formal legal process began, subtly positioning himself and Plancina as lawful Roman citizens awaiting due process, rather than fugitives fleeing trial. Yet, if Piso succeeded in retaking Syria, he could then return to Rome, with 3 legions at his back. Agrippina could only hope Sentius Saturninus knew what he was doing. Following approximately 3 weeks on the Hemiolia, Agrippina and her party finally approached Italy. In order to garner as much support from the people as possible, she had chosen to moor at the port of Brundisium, the farthest port from Rome, over that of the closer port of Ostia, along the Tiber River. Yet as they closed in, the Hemiolia veered right and moored instead at the island of Corfu. Agrippina and her party disembarked and stayed in the villa of Corfu's most prominent citizen. As she recovered from her sea voyage and prepared for her momentous landing in Italy, word was sent to Brundisium announcing the imminent arrival of the widow Agrippina, bearing the ashes of her illustrious husband. After resting for 2 or 3 days on Corfu and preparing for what lay ahead, Agrippina and her party departed the island, making the short crossing to Brundisium. Standing on the deck of her hemiolia as it entered the port, Agrippina beheld the results of her delay. More than 10,000 people had gathered, filling the docks, balconies and loggias of surrounding buildings, with many even climbing rooftops, all to honour and catch a glimpse of the widow bearing the remains of their beloved hero, Germanicus. The crowds looked on in silence as dockhands and the ship's crew diligently lashed the hemiolia to the pier and lowered the gangplank. Dressed in a homespun mourning stola, her gaze fixed on the ground, Agrippina descended slowly, clutching her husband's ashes, her 3 young children trailing behind. As she stepped onto the floating wharf, Brundisium's officials and a cohort of soldiers dispatched by Tiberius as an honour guard awaited her, honouring her solemn return to Italy. Agrippina then raised her head, her tear-streaked eyes sweeping over the crowd, which filled every possible vantage point. Suddenly, the silence that had gripped Brundisium harbour shattered, erupting into a single, unified groan of agony. It was as if the people, refusing to believe the news until they saw the urn for themselves, released a collective cry of disbelief and sorrow, a sound that echoed Agrippina's own heartbreak, always on the verge of overwhelming her. Moved by the piercing, glorious song of lamentation in the air, Agrippina surrendered to its pity and despair. Her tears flowing freely, she dropped to her knees, placing Germanicus's urn on the wharf. Wild with grief, she tore the veil from her head, letting loose a mass of unkempt hair that whipped in the wind. As the crowd's groans swelled, she yielded to it, yearning to release the exquisite torment that had burned within her since the moment Germanicus took his last breath. Gripping the neck of her mourning stola, Agrippina tore it down the middle, her anguished cry rising above all else, seeming to drown out the world itself. Following the spectacle of her arrival in Brundisium, Agrippina and her children took up residence in the local governor's villa while preparations were made for her procession across Italy. Martina, the Syrian poisoner whose testimony would be crucial in Agrippina's charges against Piso and Plancina, was discreetly removed from the hemiolia and imprisoned in a secret location within Brundisium, heavily guarded. Agrippina could not risk Martina being discovered by the angry mourners, who, blaming her for Germanicus's death, would surely tear her apart. No, Martina had to stay alive, at least until the trial. As Agrippina, escorted by Tiberius's honour guard, began her slow journey across Italy, half of the Brundisium crowd joined the procession. The growing funeral march made its way slowly up the Via Appia, attracting people who travelled from as far as 10 miles, just so they could stand along the roadside and pay their respects. For nearly 2 months, Agrippina's procession edged closer to Rome, gathering mourners at every stop. In each town, local magistrates greeted her with deepest sympathies, inviting her and her family to attend honorary funeral services and sacrifices held in their forums. At Terracina, however, things were different. The magistrates greeted Agrippina, and sacrifices were held in honour of Germanicus, but the funeral services were also attended by a large delegation of officials who had made the 2-day journey from Rome to serve as her formal escort on the last leg of her pilgrimage. As Agrippina surveyed those present, dressed in their most official togas, she began to recognize some familiar faces. Leading the delegation was Claudius, Germanicus's younger brother, alongside Tiberius's son Castor. And with them, surrounded by a group of senators, were Agrippina's eldest sons, Nero and Drusus Caesar. Dropping her composure, Agrippina rushed forward, throwing herself into the arms of the 2 children she had seen only once or twice in the last 5 years. Now surrounded by all 6 of her children and members of her late husband's family, she looked around, dazed and bewildered. The crowd of important men representing Rome's formal delegation seemed incomplete. Not only was Germanicus's mother Antonia absent, but so was his grandmother, the Augusta. But most important of all, where was Tiberius?